Eu espero que possam me ouvir. Podem me ouvir? Ok, que bom. Então, muito obrigada pela apresentação e pelo espaço para debater nossa pesquisa hoje. Muito obrigada, Lucia, e a todos os colegas e as colegas, Tânia, Wagner e todas as colegas que possibilitaram essa conferência. Muito obrigado à Ariola e ao Gary pela congenialidade e por tudo que tem acontecido. E por todos que têm um papel nesse evento. Temos aqui um filme gravado em uns slides e eu escrevi alguns pensamentos sobre o meu tópico hoje. Pedagogia online para além da sala de aula. Obviamente, esse trabalho é sempre um esforço colaborativo e eu derivo de alguns projetos, de experiências de projeto, que são o escopo do que irei compartilhar hoje. Gostaria de ressaltar que a influência de alguns colegas. Assim, gostaria de falar com vocês um pouco sobre o nosso centro. Estamos operacionais desde 2017. Como Lúcia disse, apenas 4 colegas no início, em 2017. E agora somos um grupo de 20 colegas. 10 pesquisadores associados que nos acompanham lecionando na faculdade. Mas boa parte deles exercem o papel da pesquisa full-time. Temos agora uma comunidade de 62 doutorandos de diferentes programas. E, tradicionalmente, temos Geo Awards, e foi concebido pela Universidade do Reino Unido. E temos um PhD online. Meu trabalho com Ariola abarca a internacionalização contextualizada e tem a ver com a educação de uma perspectiva local e global. Tem a ver com ensino, com práticas de aprendizado, estratégias pedagógicas, assim como políticas e ainda importantemente, um engajamento da universidade junto à sociedade. Vou falar hoje sobre o aprendizado internacional colaborativo. E essa é uma abordagem que a Coventry tem feito bastante, que temos pesquisado. A mim importa muito que questões terminológicas são muito prevalentes. Eu vou colocar algumas referências para um artigo que pode ser útil. Esse slide se baseia num artigo muito recente na literatura terminológica e os principais temas e tendências e limitações. E eu também gostaria de ressaltar que o aprendizado colaborativo internacional, COLO, é o cerne da internacionalização. Isso significa que a ideia é estar propositalmente aberto para perspectivas internacionais em um currículo formal e informal para todos os estudantes. O COLO é parte da digitalização do currículo e o seu intento é incluir cada vez mais estudantes a partir de localizações geográficas. E na literatura, vemos que há uma sugestão para o crescimento das universidades, de formas a vislumbrar uma forma mais segura, menos exclusiva e mais inclusiva de experiência global para os estudantes. Eu ouço muito as preocupações sobre acesso e inclusão e a luta pela inclusão no espaço online. E isso é parte do que eu gostaria de tratar. Mas, primeiramente, gostaria de compartilhar alguns pensamentos com vocês sobre o que é o colo. Ele engloba os aprendizados e a colaboração online. Tem o foco na interação transnacional e visa a transformação do aprendizado. E isso é frisado em peças gravadas e escritas. O foco aqui é muito importante, pois trata de uma discussão entre aqueles que aprendem, entre as instâncias políticas e vislumbra englobar a todos em prol da ação. Há benefícios que devem ser mutuamente considerados. Então, o debate no espaço de colo pode ser entre disciplinas ou interdisciplinar. Eu não falo muito sobre educação superior num contexto universitário, onde podemos ver as formas como o foco do colo pode ser voltar-se para um problema. Uma única disciplina não poderia resolver isso. Por exemplo, estudantes de geografia do Coventry se juntam a estudantes de arquitetura e engenheiros civis ou estudantes de engenharia civil. E nessa forma transdisciplinar, examinam, planejam moradias, abordagens, de modos a reduzir o risco de desastres. E nesse exemplo, vemos a oportunidade de engajamento produtivo junto às comunidades, com parceiros da indústria, com programas educacionais comunitários, agregando os aprendizes em um ecossistema de aprendizado, a sociedade civil. E boa parte do foco nesse campo de estudo visa um Estado orientado à ação. Ao invés de conceitualizar ideias e soluções, nós tomamos ação, com foco em abordar questões de relevância política e social. Nossa ideia é promover a pedagogia do colo, uma colaboração, uma conexão colaborativa, fomentando relações entre aprendizes, entre estudantes, com foco no contexto de aprendizado. Em meus escritos eu falo sobre esse ponto que não há tecnologia para a justiça. E, francamente, Franklin fala sobre a importância do escopo de justiça social. É algo tão presente em nossos debates desde ontem até hoje, pois temos a adotar essa perspectiva crítica pedagógica. E Franklin observa a tecnologia como uma prática. O que acontece quando reproduzimos práticas educacionais em formas disfuncionais? Quando pressupomos que os estudantes têm acesso à tecnologia, quando pressupomos que a pedagogia em sala de aula pode ser suspensa num espaço online, ou o COIL em si é uma forma de vivenciar o currículo internacional. Nós debatemos que o COIL não é uma tendência relacionada a aspectos que queremos representar, mas precisamos pensar as séries de dimensões em que, de fato, devemos considerar a direção do nosso esforço. Eu falo também sobre estabelecerem áreas de trabalho, recursos e os esforços necessários para que possamos propiciar a mudança virtual. Muito brevemente, a digitalização, a lacuna na digitalização. Eu sei que falarei sobre isso mais tarde, mas abordagens de ensino à distância têm sido desenvolvidas desde os anos 90 e nós vivemos em um mundo conectado.
the pandemic has laid bare this variation between access to technology and internet and pupils' home learning environments, and poorer pupils in the UK and in Brazil, yes, less likely to have the devices, the internet access, and the home environment conducive for learning. And also, we can't assume access to computers and the internet guarantees digital capital. The linguistic gap, we talked about this a lot, it's so key. Considering our verbal and linguistic proficiency in the online space. There was a case study by Bassini and Buchem in 2019, which included students across Brazil, France, and Germany, and they were doing a virtual exchange. But the study exemplified how this engagement was negatively impacted because of students' low confidence in communicating in English, which was the common language that they thought would be suitable for everyone. So we have to have important discussion here around multilingual language production, around ensuring linguistic repertoires of students don't get left behind, the opportunity for trans-languaging and pluralistic approaches. Yes, maybe there is utility of English, but not the imperialism of it. And I was discussing this with Niall Curry just yesterday. And then the structural gaps. So the institutional internationalization plans of universities, the infrastructure to support academics, to facilitate. We have to think about how staff expertise is steered and how practices are resourced and how these exchanges are embedded in learning. So they're not standalone, but they have disciplinary and transdisciplinary relevance. We know the reality is that these exchanges take effort, they take time to usefully, meaningfully get these contexts together. And it can take trust and confidence amongst staff and learners, community learners, especially around territorial approaches of language, cultural understandings, and importantly, we've talked about bringing it down to the intersections of personal characteristics of our race, our gender, age, neurodiversity, needing all to be taken into consideration. But I think what I'm trying to say is I've felt there's so many examples of where virtual exchange could be of value across learning communities, the learning education ecosystem, and this active learning, this meaningfully questioning and challenging each other in proactive ways to exchange our knowledge. And I know from the experience in Coventry, these experiences can be very powerful and very memorable. And the learner feedback is so important here because students, learners may not like this kind of exposure. They may not realize the significance of the exchange at the time. And so preparation and reflection are very important for sense making. So I'll leave it there. I think I've used up lots of time, but I hope I've said some useful things that can stimulate some debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just to say that Catherine's slides, the paper, and the video would be available on the website. So just look in the resource section, and what we have done is follow Catherine's advice and do both. So we have them in English and in Portuguese. So you don't have to worry about translating. You have the paper and every other thing in both languages. So thank you very much for that. And that will be the same for all the resources here. I think we have a little bit of time for questions. How long do we have, Lucia, till we break for? We have a break. Okay, so we have another 10 minutes for discussion. So does anybody want to have any questions for Catherine? especially around online pedagogies, but particularly around COIL, the Collaborative Online International Learning. Is there any precedence in Brazil using this? Or any questions around it in general? You can put your questions in the chat, or you can ask for the floor if you are a presenter.
Thank you, Ariola. I would like to congratulate and just to echo what both Catherine and Ariola mentioned. And I was talking about it earlier on with Spolander and all the others who had been here since 6:30. And perhaps what we are doing here today is our passion for researching, the indissociability between the one researching and our ethical, political commitment to our research subject. This is what moves us on and the cycles ahead of us with that emotion, with that enthusiasm, with our Latin touch, where Brazil is one of its Latin American representatives. So I would like to thank you for your presentation and move on straight away to the next discussion, which will bring us great reflections. So I would like to introduce and invite to talk about the ideas, Professor Wipeni. She's a teacher of the Research in Global Education. She is the head research subject. As she said yesterday, she worked as an occupational therapist for 10 years in the healthcare field, followed by 10 years as a scholar, lecturing both for undergraduate students as to postgraduate students in therapy and occupational therapy programs. In the Center of Life Studies of the University of Coventry, she had been awarded for her thesis in 2009. Since 2010, she had been full-time working as a researcher, and she started her work she started her work in 2017, and she had been one great partner, not only from the very project, but leading another project with the university. And moreover, she'd been developing researches and partnerships, discussing with Professor Kirian of the education program, as well as with other colleagues. So, Professor Catherine, welcome. We are all here very enthusiastic to hear you.
Eu vou falar em português. This is the second time that I followed this presentation. The first time was in Coventry in a meeting with colleagues from other countries and also from the Open University of UK. Here I have a few questions. One of them is the difference between the use of the online collaborative spaces as a tool. I don't know if the word tool is correct, for interactions inside the online learning. The other question is, how is this appropriate, or this is embraced by the private institutions in Brazil? This is the expansion of the offer of online courses without any quality indicators. This is just a market here in Brazil, and sometimes if you access that market, it's because you are a poor worker that you cannot access the university during the work hours. This is one of the issues. The third issue is the difficulty and the generational issue. There are two aspects. One is the difficulty to have a quality access of internet, considering the internet here is paid if I'm going to use it in my house, and especially those who live in remote locations of the country and also in urban areas. If the third one is the generational issue, how difficult it is for people after a certain age to use technology. And I was wondering here in Talita's work, and we have a group at WOFIS for elderlies, and I think the main activity is to teach the women to use the smartphones, because all of them have smartphones, but many of them don't know how to use them, to use the resources that the smartphone offers, of course. So I'd like to hear a little bit more, if it's possible. How can we think COIL inside a reality mediated by these numbers of challenges and difficulties as we have here in Brazil? But thank you very much for your presentation, because it makes us think. And I want to give another testimony. I'm taking a course to try to understand English, because this is not a business. It's very difficult to learn another language after a certain age. And I studied English my whole life, but I never actually learned. Now I'm learning with the American Embassy, and it has been an interesting process. But also, we see that even among the teachers, not all of them use technology very easily and all the resources that the course offers. But to me, it has been a very interesting experience. So I'm not saying that of course everybody has their potentialities, but how to think about that in other realities.
We are working on COIL across universities predominantly. It is used a little across Europe in school settings, but it's mainly been our experience across university partners. And we've been doing projects with colleagues in Jordan and also in South Africa. These are large consortium projects including many universities, and each context has its own issues. In South Africa, very much the consideration of rural learners, language issues between the rural communities and the urban communities. Connectivity issues within the country are very different as well. And I think when we're looking at issues of connectivity, it's, as I was saying, it's different when students have access to the connectivity on the campus, which makes it a lot easier. But during COVID, yes, when learners were online at home, having to pay for their own data and Wi-Fi, that is a very big challenge. I think this is part of the discourse, that we can't assume inclusivity. I think you're absolutely right. It takes a lot of effort in terms of the skills to design these types of learning exchanges and that negotiation, whether it is within the country. In Jordan, we were very interested that they were doing national virtual exchange across universities in rural and community areas, engaging learners who otherwise wouldn't connect and share their ideas about the discipline or issues around sustainable development, etc. So the exchange can happen in very many ways, using a mobile phone to much more sophisticated computers through access at the university. But you're right about digital fluency and this importance of, we can't assume learners feel comfortable to navigate in that space. So this is about the preparation, the time, you know, to prepare and have resources. And I say in some ways it could be resource intensive, but we also see choral exchanges happening via mobile phones at much more straightforward levels, and it still works and it could still be powerful. I think the idea of it, that we can engage with learners who otherwise maybe would not, of course, get on any physical mobility to another country. That always used to be, you know, the ideal of internationalization, that you travel. And of course we don't. We can stay at home and learn a lot with international connectivity, but we can't just take it for granted that we have that. So the digital fluency, the digital capital, the infrastructure, yeah, we have to think about these things. But with our partners, we've been looking at that and trying to make it happen. And I think it's exciting work. It's got to be more exciting to link with community. But I was thinking just yesterday about this importance of maybe bridging programs, trying to get, you know, learners access into higher education and sharing of practices. But I was also wondering about the permanence of these types of educational approaches, especially in community. So I think there's questions about issues of permanence for those who are joining as community partners and what's in it for them. Because for students at the university, this goes towards their modules, their credits, their degree programs. But we have to think very carefully of the benefits of engaging with community. And I think there's lots to research here, lots to do. But I think it's a fertile space. And certainly it feels a lot of countries around the world are looking at it, are thinking about it. Not least, though, getting across some of the challenges to do it meaningfully.
Ok, muito obrigado. Catherine, Thalita, você tinha uma pergunta? Você quer perguntar ou quer que eu leia? Está no chat aqui. Ok, até a Jody pode falar também, porque tem uma pergunta sobre intensividade, pessoas com deficiência ou com neurodiversidade. Isso é uma outra premissa. Eu acho que a Jody falou um pouco sobre isso. Mas se você quiser mencionar ou falar sobre isso, também seria legal.
Well, I think this comes back to what is the negotiated learning activities that are going on. Because in these COIL exchanges, learners can be synchronously or asynchronously engaged. So they can be, like we are now, live discussion, or it could be that learners can access content and material. It's held somewhere where time can be taken to translate and to, you know, engage in different ways with the material. So it's not always live action. I think there's a lot more to do in terms of the online space and neurodiversity issues, which you've mentioned. I think we've been looking at the idea of this third space, this challenging space where people come together and feel they have voice and agency in that space. But I think it's very much comes back to what's the purpose of getting together. And it will engage students in doing local learning as well as the international sharing. So I think there's many examples of how it can absolutely include those with mobility or or issues which otherwise would prevent them being able to access, the issues of having to engage in international discourse through, of course, the mobility issue, as in traveling abroad. But I think there's so much to do yet about unpacking neurodiversity in this. But yeah, I think we don't know enough about it from neurodiverse students' perspectives for COIL exchange. It's an under-researched area. But I think I also was a little concerned, absolutely, about, what we've heard from colleagues' research areas, and what I'm bringing today. It may feel it's somewhat off on a tangent from where our discussion was from this morning, but I think it is a part of our practice together to share different ideas, and I hope, I'm more than happy to respond and maybe to talk with people outside and share resources and learning.
Talvez seria útil começar um blog sobre essa questão específica, porque Maria fez uma outra pergunta muito importante em relação a como a tecnologia pode ser usada pela classe política por questões muito sistemáticas, e a ideia de homogeneidade e heterogeneidade na comunidade. Eu acho que alguém estava se referindo isso ao uso de livros ou outros espaços que fornecem educação do tipo comercial, só por causa que não foca tanto no aprendizado, mas só em fatos que não se engajam tanto os educandos como Paulo Freire queria. Então esse é um outro ponto. Você pode responder isso rapidamente e depois a gente pode continuar.
I think it's so much the importance of facilitation in these exchanges is key. I think absolutely that the collaborative aspect is really so important, and for learners to give feedback. But the facilitating of this, and we know from Jordan and their experience there, that students have been skilled in facilitating the exchanges. So in Jordan, we work with a number of e-tutors, they were named, who had an interface between the faculty, the professor, and their peers, and facilitated discussion. And they had training and support to be facilitators in exchanges. And I think that was a good step in the right direction to also look at, how the conversation doesn't get dominated by someone, and that there's feedback and reflection on this. It is a challenging space. I think it can be challenging. It can be uncomfortable. And it's there to try and support agency and voice. But I think we also recognize it can serve to silence voices. So this is this importance of setting up the collaboration. But I think in the online, just as we are here, there's the chat function, and there's this opportunity for the activities to be constructed in ways that are meaningful, which means it may not always rely on dialogue. There could be other activities in which there's much more shared problem solving with, the emphasis on the collective. But I think a lot more research is required.
Okay, good morning. Good morning, Professor Catherine. I felt very inspired by your research and by your line of work for so much time. I think it is an extremely important area that we can promote improvements to the educational processes from this research. But I was very much inspired thinking about Brazil's reality. I work with professional and technological education institutions here in Brazil from the federal network. It is a much more structured network than the states in municipal structures. And during the pandemic, we realized how we established the non-presential and the remote learning, as we call here. We also call non-presential pedagogical activities. And two important points. We noticed that during the pandemic, we only managed to establish the return to the academic activities in most of the institutions when the resources for the students were enabled, resources for them to acquire equipment, whether they are computers or smartphones or tablets, or if there is if they could borrow or rent this equipment, for example. There was a very serious issue that I included here in the chat room, that with the people with disabilities, besides the people without disabilities, without having access to internet, both because they were in remote locations, and I am in a place here that I can have a good internet, but there are many connectivity issues. So I think I just would like to bring to you to this problem, to this area of research, how we are perceiving people with disabilities. There was a research here in Brazil articulated with the University of São Paulo and two universities in São Paulo and one here in the Espírito Santo, about how people with disabilities have managed to adapt to this remote learning situation. As much as the situation and the professionals try to promote the accessibility issue, it was still very difficult to be successful. And we saw that the research revealed that about 12% of the teachers who work with the special students somehow, I don't know if it is the right words to accept, but they believed that it was possible that these students would lose the whole year. So we saw a distinction between the typical students without any disabilities, that there is a struggle for them to participate in the remote activities, the online activities, and the students with disabilities. So with this reality, we have to think how we cannot disconnect the students from the reality where they are inserted. And the challenge was to overcome this modality of learning in a way that it's not only one more way to exclude people who are poor with no access to information, and workers class without access to internet, and workers students, and students with disabilities. I think it is a challenge. Lucia also mentioned here the people with older ages that are in open university. So we have a range of students who I believe that we only looked at them. It's not only a reflection of the online learning model, but before the pandemic, I think we also had some problems about the permanence and the possibility of these students continue to study, and from their abilities and potentialities, they cannot be excluded. Sometimes we look at people only with the disabilities and we disregard the other skills that this person might have. So this is something that we have to look, especially with the poor and the worker class students and the students with disabilities. How can we bring them in our area of research, if we are thinking that we are advancing about making our educational process more automated. So we have to ask ourselves, who are we doing this for? It is always very present, what we call here meritocracy. So when the student is poor and he has a good performance academically and can participate, it's because of his merits. But when he cannot develop because of many issues that influence his bad performance, sometimes we neglect these people. So this is something important that we have to think about. Thank you very much for your work.
Yes, thank you, Talita. I must say this, we're talking about e-learning generally, perhaps now, and I guess what I've been talking about also is part of internationalizing the curriculum at university level. And I absolutely accept that there are a lot of issues around e-learning in general and how learners access learning remotely, especially when the campus is shut. So I couldn't tell you if the COIL exchanges even occurred during COVID. This would be a piece of research to see which survived during COVID, because I don't think that was looked at. I know we looked at e-learning, but that's broader. That's a much broader idea of how we deliver learning. And we have done some surveys around remote learning during the COVID pandemic. And yeah, there was a lot of struggle there for Coventry students too. But I think you're making some really important points. COIL is not to replace ways of learning. It's for Coventry, at best, a student might have one experience of that across their degree. So this is to think around the way that universities claim their graduates are global graduates, that they are global ready. And what does that mean? What opportunities do they have to engage across geographies with learners of different ideas and perspectives, to inform them, to challenge them, but also to problem solve and work together? And I think COIL is being offered as a pedagogy to engage in that international conversation, because we know that otherwise, where will it happen? It can happen very locally too in international campuses. It could happen in Coventry because we have a very multi-ethnic city. So learners can know about each other and cultures, and we have international students coming to campus and there's dialogue there. But I think we're looking at COIL as a means as another complementary way as part of internationalization to engage learners across contexts. But it's not possible for everybody or in every context. And I'm certainly hoping we're not getting confused generally with the wider topic of e-learning and inclusivity. This is a more focused piece around internationalization of curriculum. But I absolutely take the point that we aren't researching enough about neurodiverse learners and COIL. And I welcome us to work together on that. Maybe we could do a study together and think about developing our research practice with this population of learners. I'd very much welcome that.
Fantástico, muito obrigada, Catherine. Eu adorei a discussão, então, se vocês quiserem colocar os seus pensamentos, suas ideias lá no blog, para a gente poder continuar essa conversa em outros fóruns, seria muito útil para projetos como esse. Eu volto para a Lúcia agora, que vai falar sobre o último palestrante.